Genshin's biggest flaw is FOMO. The fear of missing out. Playing a game like a schedule. Genshin has its own pace to how you can play. From time-limited talent domains and weekly bosses for Ascension materials, to time-limited events, most of which are important to the story. But besides that, events are the bread and butter for an F2P. Dailies, which a month will get you 10 pulls. Every resource for primogems is counted and calculated. This isn't so bad, but it does get tedious. Because of Genshin's center around schedule and holding time hostage, this puts a strain on progression. Building characters can take weeks to months. That's only if you are prepping ahead of time, which still applies to the schedule. I haven't even mentioned the stamina system. You have 160, but the cost for rewards is 20, 30, and 40. You can't do much. So you have to really manage your stamina and what you want to do. The higher the level, the more stamina you need. World bosses cost 40. Talents cost 20. Weekly bosses cost 30. And weekly bosses, that's usually not a concern but more of a grind depending on whether it's a tedious fight or you don't have the right team built, or the boss is locked behind the story or region. Speaking of the story, it has its ups and a lot of downs. Why might I say this? Time, or rather the pacing. Most dialogue interactions are drawn out. That's not to say Genshin has poor storytelling. There are good stories that are engaging. For me, the most recent is The Golden Slumber. But in other cases, the dialogue feels stretched for the sake of padding, making interactive dialogue to slow players down. But when your aim is for progressing through the story is to build a character whose and mats are locked behind said story, you create problems, which I see as a flaw. It's even worse when you finally get to the boss and find your favorite built team is ineffective to the boss. Now you have to either use characters you benched or just try to finish what would be a tedious boss fight. Speaking of tedious battles, that brings me to my next flaw. The combat. Which isn't the combat exactly but rather certain enemies. They either have cheap attacks to burn time, which is sometimes needed for progression, or an attack that is both tanky and lethal. Not to mention, some enemies are immune to certain forms of damage, which might again force you to play a way you don't find entertaining. Genshin has poor design when it comes to enemy combat. Not all but a lot. Now features and improvements. Higher resin cap and a resin bank. Introduce another condensed resin item with a higher amount. Don't lock the item behind the story. Either give it by mail or at most tie it to reasonable rank or free character, like Barbara or Kali. This new character can come with a mission that gives the new craftable item for condensed resin, which could use 2 at once, 5 at once, or all. Next improvement is scheduled domains tied to character ascension. This is simple. Either make them more frequent, or make all open on the weekend, Friday to Sunday. Next is a select feature for map markers. Select all, delete, color, or separate types like map markers and map checks, like an interactive checklist. Actually, I have a better idea: to tie the adventure handbook to the map. The handbook uses the map to farm enemies. Might as well document materials. Once found, mark that on the map. We're going to use the interactive map online anyway, so might as well make it more accessible, if possible, and bring it in-game. Next is locked materials behind story progression. Add either NP that explore on our behalf like a separate expedition. In return for expedition, we have to do favors. This NCP should be accessible from early on, so leeway or Mondstadt. Then we ask for materials after a certain amount of time. They will have it in exchange for favors. Could be a weekly thing, could cost resin, or condense resin. I don't know, I just know locking Ascension materials behind the story is messed up, and this would make Genshin more new player friendly. My next idea is the least likely in my opinion, which honestly might hurt the game's profit in some way. But my idea was ways to obtain masterless stardust and maybe glitter. Now I was thinking, what if we got another feature, like the Abyss? But instead of primos, we get masterless stardust. It could be just like domains but doesn't cost resin. This would serve as a battle mode. Combat survival mode. No timer. Just fight. 3 different types but all the same in rewards. Casual, intermediate and hardcore. But each type has 2 variations. First variation is light enemies and light mini-bosses. Second variation, light and heavy enemies with bosses. Casual has the lowest level or matches your world level. Intermediate has higher level monster and higher stats. Hardcore should be the next step. Really push the difficulty. The rewards are based on progression and surviving waves. But casual and intermediate reward the same amount. Hardcore should reward a higher amount of Masterless Stardust, and a limited amount of Star Glitter like 25. Which could be exchanged for Fate's weapons or materials. Basically people can be more lenient with Masterless Star Glitter instead of just Fates if they're a spender. If they're F2P they can save up for weapons. If they choose to. Also this domain would have a max amount of Masterless Stardust and Glitter you can receive before it resets depending on the amount. If it's generous once a month it resets. If not twice a month like the Abyss. But like the Abyss you can receive the rewards as you please. There's no time lock. You can grind if you want for rewards in a day or before reset. Maybe if you reach max rewards, you get resin back. I'm being super generous, but I think it's fair, especially for hardcore players. Maybe like each wave you earn back a few points of resin. 4 or 8. This just builds options to play longer, so long as it's fun. Now next improvements is combat, and I honestly do not have an idea for this. It's more about the enemies, but I don't see how they can change that, so instead, I think certain enemies should just engage the players differently. No cheap attacks or time burning. Just straightforward battles. As for strategy, don't hide behind immunity and barriers. If they do have a barrier, make it like a block that can be broken, instead of another health bar that is likely immune to an element. No annoying staggering or one-shots. Then again, I'm neither a game designer or understand combat, I just know what I think is annoying to fight. All I can say is combat shouldn't just be challenging but fun. This is slightly off topic, but I think all these flaws contribute to the issue. That is burnout. Now, I'd like to define burnout. I've noticed a lot of burnout in the Genshin community since the start. Some people run out of content and get bored. Others become so far behind that they feel obligated to catch up. This leaves them to feel overwhelmed and eventually drained. I say that to say this. Boredom is not burnout. Burnout is when you feel overwhelmed. Boredom is normal for gaming. But this is before games revolved around schedules and real-life time. This can turn a perfectly fun game into a chore or job. I'm not saying that it's all bad, but it's certainly not all good either and should be addressed instead of telling people to quit or Genshin isn't for everyone. Avoiding any type of criticism. Genshin has room for improvement, and it has improved since the start, but it can get even better. This is only possible with addressing the flaws and criticism. I say that to say this. Burnout should never even associate with games. Games are a form of escapism. When you become bored you play another game, then return to the game you was once bored of. That in my opinion has more to do with one's personality. I have friends who can play games for a month, then get bored. I personally play a limited amount of games and never get bored. But burnout is another beast. Anyone can experience burnout, but burnout is exhausting, a mental drain. Boredom isn't. If you disagree, boredom from a job. You look for something to do but there's not enough to do. It's a slow day at work. Burnout at work. Boss throws too much at you. They're too demanding, you can never keep up the pace. They aren't the same. And misidentifying them as the same I see as a issue. It's normal to take breaks, it's not and should not be normal for games to cause burnout, and I will not sympathize with any practice that leads to burnout. Genshin needs to tone down the FOMO and I hope they eventually flesh out these issues.